Hello, this is Dr. Matthew Canham, the Executive Director of the Cognitive Security Institute. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. If you find these talks interesting, please visit our website at cognitivesecurity.institute for additional information and to learn ways to become involved in this rapidly growing community. In the week prior to this Cognitive Security Institute presentation, thousands of pagers and later handheld radios simultaneously exploded across Lebanon and Syria. This is what cognitive warfare looks like. A common perspective is that cognitive warfare is non-kinetic, but there's no reason why this needs to be the case. Physical actions may disrupt cognitive functions and vice versa. Our ability to process information through socio-technical networks is a critical factor for the survival of modern society. Dr. Ask's UnCODE model provides a framework for understanding how to defend and disrupt modern socio-technical networks.
The Cognitive Security Institute is dedicated to providing a forum for practitioners and researchers to discuss the fundamental cognitive security challenges of our time. The views expressed by presenters are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of, or endorsement by, the Cognitive Security Institute, or any affiliated organizations. Dr. Torvald F Ask is a neuroscientist. His research is focused within the fields of human factors in cybersecurity, cognitive control, psychoneuroimmunology, and neurodevelopment. Torvald holds a PhD in information security and communication technology from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. He is currently affiliated with the Faculty of Health, Welfare, and Organization at Østfold University College, Norway. Now, here is Torvald.
Thank you for the introduction. So I'm presenting the UnCODE system, which is sort of a system for thinking about cognitive warfare, specifically classifying the goals and methods of cognitive warfare. It also may have some practical utility as well, but originally I thought about it as a way of just thinking straight about cognitive warfare. It's based on this paper that I presented during the NATO STO Cognitive Warfare Symposium last year. My intention with this paper was sort of making a communication tool that would help practitioners that don't have a neuroscience background understand ways of thinking about cognitive warfare from a neurocentric perspective. So these are my co-authors. I think it's worth mentioning that we are a very broad group of people in terms of our backgrounds and interests and specialties, and that we spanned a relatively broad range of organizations. I really want to reiterate here that this is a system for thinking about cognitive warfare goals and methods. It's not saying anything definite about what current cognitive warfare capabilities are or what future cognitive warfare capabilities are going to be. Some are hypothetical, and some you could probably say, oh, but this exists already, but it's more about how to put them into a comprehensive framework. So my background, I have a Bachelor of Science in Psychology. I know there are some people with a background in psychology that frequents these talks, so they are probably familiar with the concept levels of analysis. And that's something that I took with me from my psychology studies, where it's basically saying that if you want to understand phenomena related to humans, you have to understand the biological, including the genetical factors that influence how they behave and how they operate, how they react to their environment, as well as the psychological factors and also the social factors, which includes things such as group dynamics, group membership, and social structures. Also conducted a lot of research in different topics, ranging from resilience to neurodevelopment and neuroimmunology. So I kind of got a very broad perspective on how to both understand these things theoretically, but also kind of study and manipulate them. I then took a Master of Neuroscience at the Kavli Institute for Systems Neuroscience, where I spent a year doing transcription factor reprogramming of stem cells to study neurodevelopment. And this is basically biohacking, real biohacking. After my Master of Neuroscience, I got a PhD just recently in information security and communication technology, and here I applied neuroergonomics to study performance enhancement among cyber cadets, including improving communication between people under stress and in operative settings. And also this is where I got my introduction to human-computer interaction. So it's a very broad background that spans social and psychological things, but also molecular things at the very like nitty-gritty nuts and bolts kind of approach to the human brain, and then human factors and human-computer interactions.
So I want to take a small detour now, because I want to explain what I did during my master's, because I think it's an interesting thing in terms of just demonstrating how progress in molecular science and neuroscience has sort of this dual use purpose for two reasons. I think it is often overlooked, although it's mentioned in some papers. When people are discussing cognitive warfare, it is very often overlooked. Also, it reflects how I think about things in general. So I think it's informative in that it serves as an analogy for understanding the paper and how the thinking is in terms of having some sort of method to gain access to the system where cognition occurs, and then how to manipulate it in order to have a desired effect.
So I assume most of you have some type of understanding of what a virus is, given the recent events. Basically, a virus is a very small, brainless particle that doesn't have a will at all. And the way that the virus works is that it infects a host, some type of cell, plant cell, human cell, animal cell, and then it inserts its genetic material and enzymes into the host, hijacks its protein-producing machinery, and makes it start producing more viruses, so it replicates. So that's how a virus works. It's mainly the proteins in the membrane of the virus that decides which type of cells that it will infect. For instance, right now you have a bunch of viruses inside of your lungs, but it won't infect your lungs because the proteins on the surface of the virus is not compatible with the proteins on the surface of the cells in your lungs. Maybe they're viruses that will infect plants and other types of animals instead. But there's a bunch of viruses around us all the time, and some clever scientists figured out that, okay, you have these proteins that decides which type of cells it will infect, or what type of cell that will be infected by the payload, which hijacks the cell. This can be hacked. So the thought was that if you can manipulate the selectivity of the virus, and you can manipulate the payload, you can manipulate the target. And this has been done a bunch of times for a bunch of different applications. I think a lot of the useful ones have been making viruses that have proteins that specifically target cancer cells, and then delivering deadly payloads to those cells, but not being able to infect any healthy cells. That's one application. Or infecting different types of neurons inside of animals, so that we can understand how different types of cells contribute to behavior by having the virus kill off those cells. So I specifically used it to differentiate stem cells into neurons. So I basically assembled a modified HIV virus that was only capable of infecting pluripotent stem cells, human pluripotent stem cells, I should say, which are stem cells that can turn into any type of cell. And the payload that was inside that virus specifically targeted the machinery that decides that the cell will differentiate into a neuron.
And the way that payload works is that it sort of puts the system for differentiating it into a excitatory neuron in place, but it will only do so if you also introduce a compound that activates this machinery. So in my case, it was a compound called doxycycline. So
My immediate thought back then was, okay, what happens if I put a bunch of these viruses into a mixture and give it to another person? Will all of their stem cells be infected and then just have this thing dormant inside of them? And then if I put doxycycline in their foods, will the stem cell differentiate into excitatory neurons and then make the person have a seizure or something like that, like an epileptic seizure? Is it possible to modify the virus so that it only infects cells inside of a brain of a grown human that is involved in risk-taking behavior, so that I can make it more likely that they will engage in risk-taking behaviors and then make them neglect long-term goals? Because we know from before, there's a growing amount of studies that indicate that the parasite Toxoplasma gondii, if it infects humans, it will increase their risk-taking behaviors. So this is sort of the kind of dual use that is sort of attached to all of these nice biological developments in neuroscience and molecular biology and stuff. And Giordano, that had a presentation a couple of talks ago, published on this. So if you're interested in these specific attack vectors, then you should look up his research.
Well, so how did I get into cognitive warfare? Well, all of the stuff that I did with viruses and brain development stuff, that was during my master's. It wasn't until I got into my PhD that I really got exposed to cognitive warfare. I mean, I obviously heard excerpts from and read excerpts from like Sun Tzu over the years. During my bachelor's, I was exposed to operative psychology through Ricardo, which is one of the co-authors on the UnCODE paper, because he did some research with cyber cadets at the time. But it wasn't until I sort of started doing research for my PhD where I studied military cyber operative teams and tried to enhance their performance that I also was exposed to problems related to remote social engineering of soldiers, and also sort of got attuned to the effect that the cognitive load that cyber cadets are exposed to and how it affects their performance. I published the ACID paper together with Matt and the other co-authors on the UnCODE paper, which further got me into the manipulation of narratives and how to sort of take advantage of stress or stressful events to make people hypervigilant. Then my main supervisor on my PhD project, Benjamin Knox, sort of tricked me into reading a bunch of cognitive warfare papers, which is when I really got hooked on the concept. I read a bunch of old papers and new papers and literature that really tries to define and provide an understanding of cognitive warfare, what it means in this new context. All of them have really like cool perspectives, different perspectives, but cool perspectives and cool ideas that shaped how I think about cognitive warfare. Specifically, it helped me identify the limitations and challenges around cognitive warfare, specifically how we think about cognitive warfare from an academic perspective, but also from a practitioner's point of view. And then also, via Ben, I got invited to write a chapter in the HFM 356 Cog War technical report, published via NATO STO. It was a chapter that I co-authored with Ben, which was based on the papers that I had read. In this chapter, we argued for why cognitive warfare research shouldn't ignore the perspectives from basic neuroscience and technology research that we sort of felt was implicit in this human domain concept that people had sort of argued for. And then I took part in the HFM Cog War workshop in Oslo that was arranged by FFI. In this workshop, there was a bunch of experts from both military side, but also the scientific side that were discussing sort of the activities that NATO countries should engage in order to understand cognitive warfare and also cognitive security. And then this sort of also led to a participation in the HFM 361 a cognitive warfare symposium that was held in Madrid last year, where I presented the UnCODE paper. So this long-winded story is just all to say that I do not have a background in the military. My thoughts and my understanding of cognitive warfare is purely through the research that I've done, the cognitive warfare literature that I've read, talking to practitioners, and obviously the participation in these CSI meetings, and the tendency that I have to think about nefarious dual-use purposes for the things that I interact with.
So here are some intuitions that I think are useful for the rest of my talk that I don't think that we address well enough in the paper. So I think about cognition as an asset, a cognitive asset. I think about it sort of as an object. I don't think about it as something that is innately human or that necessary is something that humans do. I think about it as something useful, like a tool or a technology that can be used for certain types of tasks, and that humans are useful in war or in society because they are cognitive assets. So if I want to do something with a cognitive asset, if I don't want it to be useful to the people that I don't like, I can destroy that asset or steal it so that it's no longer accessible in the environment. I can sabotage it so that it is malfunctioning, maybe not destroyed completely, but it's unable to perform at the same level that it did previously. I can identify dual purpose things with those cognitive assets so that I can alter or redirect how it interacts with the environment. Or if I want to understand it, to duplicate it or do something else with it, understand how it works, I can observe it, I can research it, I can reverse engineer it, I can have this sort of fuzzing hacking approach where if it's a black box, I can present it with stimuli and then see what type of responses I get back, and then try to discern how, okay, if I give it this input, then I get this output. So that's how I can interact with this asset. And I can enhance its functionality or repair it if it's broken. So that's how I think about cognitive assets. Then logically, I think about cognitive security as putting up structural borders or barriers, either physical or organizational or whatever you want to call it, cognitive barriers in terms of strategies that you can use under different circumstances between the adversary and the cognitive asset. So one example that is not related to humans, not completely anyway, is that ChatGPT is a cognitive asset for OpenAI, which is a market leader in AI technology. Everyone knows what ChatGPT is at this point. And they launched recently their latest model, which can reason at PhD level, according to the reports that I've seen. And the idea is that you can compete with OpenAI if you understand how ChatGPT reasons, because that can inform how you make your own models. And all of a sudden you have something to offer and you're stealing the thunder of OpenAI or whatever. And one way is to sort of try to observe it or research it. You can ask ChatGPT how it resonates, how it arrived at an answer. But now OpenAI has put some structural organizational borders in place to prevent people from doing that by banning you from using the service if you ask how ChatGPT reasons. That was the last report I read. I don't know if they've changed that since a few days ago, but that was reported. But that's a barrier. The barrier is not ChatGPT itself necessarily. It's more like, okay, we see that you're trying to understand it. Now we're going to prevent you from interacting with the system. Yeah. So there have been around discussions around the cognitive warfare concept. If you read the publications on it, you will see that there are different types of viewpoints. If you've participated in the symposiums and the discussions around the concept, you will see that there is a lot of disagreement still. This is one of the more influential first papers on the cognitive warfare concept. And one of the things or sentences that they use to describe cognitive warfare is that it is the combination of the newer cyber techniques associated with information warfare and the human components of soft power, along with the manipulation aspects of psychological operations or psyops. So then you might say, okay, so it is something that uses new techniques, but it is also related to psyops. So then is cog war something new, or is it a continuation of psychological operations and information warfare? And there are people that say that no, it is completely new. It has more to do with neuroscience and less to do with cyber at all, information at all, psychological operations at all. Some people say that no, it's just a new way of performing influence operations by using social media so that you can target people more effectively. Some people say that it's part of this hybrid warfare concept, which includes influence operations and kinetic warfare, cyber, whatever. Depends kind of what type of organization you ask, I guess. But then you have actors that say there is no hybrid warfare. There's just warfare, and it has always been about controlling the perceptions of your allies and your enemies, because if you control the perceptions of your allies to influence their worldviews, you get them to support your war, you keep morale high, and you demoralize and confuse your enemies. And that's just how warfare is. And that's sort of, if you think about what Sun Tzu says or what Clausewitz says, then that's sort of in line with that type of thinking. So for some people, there are just new methods of influencing people or whatever you want to do, and your enemies and your allies, but warfare is just warfare. If cognitive warfare is new, do we need to conceptualize a cognitive domain of operations? Why not have a human domain of operations? We're talking about humans. Cognition may be confusing or misleading if we are talking about things like culture or technology or how humans interact with technology. Cognitive warfare or cognition may just be a small part of something larger, and you could say that the human is the common denominator between all domains of war. If you're talking about sea, land, airspace, or whatever, there's like humans are affecting every aspect or every domain of warfare of the current ones, and why not have a human domain of warfare? Because you can, if you want to reach cyber through something social or have a kinetic effect through social media, for instance, you go through a human. But then if dual purpose neuroscience is cognitive warfare, it's just about knowing how to influence the brain, then why not have a biological domain of operations, which would also encapsulate cognitive domains, stuff like that. Humans are biological beings, whatever. Is it really warfare is a discussion? So the same discussion that has been had with cyber warfare, if you can't really point to a cognitive attack having fatal consequences, then how can you say that it is warfare? This has sort of been settled for cyber warfare, but there's still a question about how do you measure a cognitive effect? How do you know what caused it? There are problems around the measuring of stuff, and if you have a cognitive effect that leads to some type of other outcome, is it the direct effect of some effort? And if it is new, then what about Dahl's cognitive warfare framework that he published in 1996? That framework talks about the old forms of influence operations and war theory from Sun Tzu to Boyd to what have you, and says that, okay, we can use information warfare, how we target communication technology and stuff, and combine it with research on cognitive biases and new research in cognitive science in general and in stress, and he sort of proposes this framework that really captures a lot of the things that are talked about in the more recent versions of the concept. And then if it is something, how should we address it? Can a cognitive attack be responded to with a kinetic attack? How do we attribute a cognitive attack? Even if we can say, okay, something happened here, it was a cognitive attack, how can you attribute the attack to someone's intentions? Can a cognitive attack trigger Article 5 in NATO? If you're interested in those types of discussions, there's a researcher named Lea Björgul that has published a couple of writings on that topic, including in the technical report Mitigating and Responding to Cognitive Warfare. But the way I see it, and hopefully this way will help you at least understand this UnCODE framework, there are cognitive assets that the adversary wants some type of desired interaction with. That has always been the case, and in some cases it is related to war. The ways in which these assets can be utilized have evolved. So You have had human-machine teaming for a while, but now you have more different ways of having remote human-machine teaming, and that sort of changes how you can utilize the cognitive assets that you have at your disposal, and also the methods for targeting the assets have evolved. So I kind of just see it as an increase in the opportunities and how sophisticated attacks can be, and consequently how much you can understand about these assets. So those are some of the discussions, that the topics that people disagree on. Some even say that if you do biological attacks, it's biological warfare and it's not cognitive warfare, so it shouldn't be associated with cognitive warfare. But what people do agree on in the literature is that cognitive warfare is about a system of systems, and there's a domain fusion. There is a way of using cyber, and I know some people that are listening to this are annoyed because I probably equate cyber to like cybernetics and control systems and whatever to social media use, and I am using it broadly in that sense. Obviously it will annoy someone, I'm sorry, but you can use social media to influence how people interact in groups during a mission, or you can influence technology to influence human performance more so than before, because you understand more about how to sort of permeate through these domains and systems, and you understand more about the system, so at more fundamental levels. So targets can be reached through means spanning cyberspace and meat space, and there are several methods that can be used to reach the same cognitive warfare goal as a consequence of these systems of systems and domain fusion. For instance, if you want to demoralize people in a war of attrition, you could probably use like old-fashioned methods where you just display sort of this abundance of resources. You leave your engines on, and to show to the enemy that, okay, we don't even care about wasting fuel or whatever, we have abundance of it. Or you can use social media to target the family of people that are crucial to specific operations so that they become demoralized. Or you can use technology and social media to influence biology if you understand how these things are interrelated, which again can have consequences for social interactions. And there's also this notion of that everyone is a stakeholder if you have access to some type of connected device that has read-write functions, meaning that you can provide an input to this device, share pictures and information, and the device can present you with information, then you can be targeted for cognitive warfare. And that the goal is related to cognition, that cognitive warfare is about influencing or monitoring the system where cognition occurs. Those are things that we agree on. If you read the literature, it's kind of dispersed. There's gold nuggets in almost every publication I've seen, whether they are arguing against each other or agree with each other. But there is this disconnect in the literature where the viewpoints and the understandings of the various authors that write on the subject is that they're not fully integrated with each other and not readily integratable even. So what we kind of thought about it was that there was a need for a fundament that was clearly lacking to sort of capture all of the underlying principles, to sort of tie all of this together into a comprehensive way of understanding cognitive warfare. So we proposed the UnCODE framework to capture the underlying principles and avoid misconceptions such as mind-body dualism. Some papers will talk about, oh, this had a social effect, and this had a biological effect, or this had a mental effect, and this had a biological effect. And we are using social techniques, and now we are using biological techniques. There's this disconnect that is reminiscent, at least, of the mind-body dualism that is addressed in Descartes' Error, if you have read the book, where people think that somehow biology is separate from the cognitions, that cognition is something immaterial, and that if you target biology, you have a direct effect, but if you have some type of cognitive attack, then you have an indirect effect. And that's not true. If you have a cognitive effect, it's because you had a biological effect. You influenced biology. There was also a need for it to be modular, so we needed a system or a framework for understanding cognitive warfare that was able to use for different targets and short-term and long-term goals, and that were domain agnostic, so that you were not saying that, okay, we're targeting the social domain and now we're going in cyberspace or whatever. And it also needed to include non-human cognition, so be species-agnostic, because it's increasingly evident that you can use machine cognition, ChatGPT or whatever, to create strategies or to also target humans. So you can use prompt engineering to manipulate an AI, stuff like that. If we ignore non-human cognition and the adversary doesn't ignore non-human cognition, then we have a smaller action space than the adversary. So when thinking about this UnCODE system in the paper, we wanted to make some considerations. So we wanted it to be conducive for a common language. You shouldn't need to have a neuroscience background to be able to talk about the model and put the areas where you are focusing on into this system to understand what is happening. And by extent, and more importantly, it should be actionable for decision makers. So if you are a decision maker in war, which is the ultimate target of all of these cognitive warfare approaches, as far as I'm concerned, they shouldn't have a molecular neuroscience background to be able to use it if it's useful. So that were sort of the considerations that we had. So regarding the underlying principles, we introduced this concept of neural systems, actually borrowed from Condell's book, Principles of Neural Science. So we're talking about a system that consists of neural components, and it's fractal-ish because it consists of neural components all the way down up to the highest conceptualization, if that makes sense. So if you want to influence a group of people, you are fundamentally also wanting to have an effect at the subcellular level. If you're talking about influencing humans, if you want to influence the human brain, you want to influence a single neuron and a group of neurons that the single neurons are connected to. And the effect there will mean that you can have an effect on the brain of an individual, which means that you can have an effect on a group of brains. You're still talking about neural systems. A group of brains is a neural system because it consists of neural components, individual human brains. And if you want to influence an organization or a group of organizations and groups of nations, you still have to influence a group of brains, which means that you have to influence the brain of an individual and a group of neurons and neurons at the subcellular or single cell level. This is also true for non-human neural systems as far as I'm concerned. You can do bit flipping, or you can damage a supercluster that sort of provides compute for a neural system, and so on. Some underlying principles also is that cognitive warfare goals, are based on cognition. Cognition is something that occurs in a neural system, whether they are physically connected, or if you're talking to someone, you're connected with them through pressure in the air, so you're still connected to them. And a neural system is a physical system that processes inputs and produces outputs, and that's kind of key. And a neural system changes input-output activity, so what type of information it processes and what behaviors it results in, for instance, by changing its physical state. So if a warfare goal is not concerned with changing the input-output activity, which means changing the physical state of a neural system, is not a cognitive warfare goal. So there are several goals that could be warfare goals that are not necessarily a cognitive warfare goal. And you might have thought about this already, but our approach does not distinguish
Cognition as something being or being different from motor activity,
problem-solving, perception, decision-making, sleep-wake cycles, and so on. You have a neural system that solves a problem by processing inputs and producing outputs. Sometimes that is going to sleep, sometimes that is regulating hormones, sometimes that is solving a math equation. It doesn't matter what it is. So based on this fundament that I've just discussed, the neural systems and how it relates to cognitive warfare goals, we have identified 5 goals based on how they relate to the input-output activity of a neural system. And these 5 classes of goals are called the Unplug goals, corrupt goals, disorganized goals, where organize is the key thing, diagnose, and enhance, which make up UnCODE. So Unplug, if you remember what I talked about with respect to cognitive assets, it's about eliminating the input-output ability of a target neural system. You can do that by shooting someone in the head, so killing their brain, or you can remove them from the environment where their outputs have an effect that you do not desire anymore. You can corrupt a neural system by degrading its input-output activity, causing brain damage, damaging computational clusters. You can disorganize neural systems by biasing their input-output activity. For example, if you know what input activity, what type of information or stimuli or whatever will produce a specific output, then you can do that to bias its activity. And that can be beneficial for you if you are increasing someone's morale, or it can be demoralizing or disorganizing if you are reducing cohesion in a society or making people disobey orders or whatever it is. Decrease support in war. Then we have the Diagnose classes of goals, which are goals related to monitoring or understanding the input-output activity of a target neural system. And then Enhance goals, which are self-explanatory, but relates to enhancing the input-output ability of a target neural system. That can be repairing it if it has been corrupted, or make it perform at, for example, superhuman levels. And if you look at the figure, it sort of shows that these types of goals are connected to each other, because all of the goals can be intermediary to each other, and Diagnose goals are sort of central to all of the goals. So you understand an asset if you want to know how to enhance it, or manipulate it for dual use purposes, or how to corrupt it successfully, or how to unplug it. You can use Unplug goals to diagnose things. For instance, if you have a very influential politician or thought leader, then you could kill the thought leader so that they no longer have influence over the group of people that they are influencing. And then you can monitor these groups of people to understand the life cycle or whatever, the resilience of the ideas that the thought leader have put into the heads of those people, which helps you understand how these charismatic transformational leaders can influence people and how to best prevent them from doing so if that is what you desire. And again, importantly, these 5 classes of goals will encapsulate all conceivable cognitive warfare goals, whether you are talking about neurons, if you want to enhance neurons, so manipulate a single cell to perform better, to be more resistant against environmental stressors, or to be more selective to certain types of inputs, or if you want to degrade its function by removing its synapses. They work for all types of humans, also for groups of humans, networks of humans, whether they are locally connected, so talking to each other face to face, or over the internet, so disorganized or decentralized networks, physically decentralized networks, and also if you want to influence non-human neural systems. So this neural systems / cognitive assets view kind of makes cognitive warfare goals and reaching cognitive warfare goals a matter of having access privilege, and also opens up this intrusion perspective. So I think intrusion was beautifully defined in the kill chain paper that was published by Lockheed Martin in 2011 that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And they talk about the essence of an intrusion in the following way. They say that the essence of an intrusion is that the aggressor must develop a payload to breach a trusted boundary, establish a presence inside a trusted environment, and from that presence take actions towards their objectives, be they moving laterally inside the environment or violating the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of a system in the environment. Information can be a payload, or it could be genetic material inside a virus. But if it's information that is the payload, you can introduce it to a social network or on social media or a physical social network in meat space to sort of change their narratives, which may change their perceptions, which may result in getting a military strategist fired, which will reduce the availability of that specific neural system, the single individual neural system, in the environment where their outputs have an undesired effect for the adversary. So you can think about cancel culture, or you can think about anything really, but what that goes to show is sort of this availability, intrusion, payload perspective, how that could work in practice, and also that a disorganized goal, which is changing the narrative and changing the perceptions of people, how they engage with information, can result in a unplug goal, which is removing the strategist from the neural system where they are effective. Okay, so then how do you reach these goals? Well, if you think about cognitive assets and you have this intrusion perspective, then influencing or monitoring a neural system hinges on what type of access you can get to the neural systems. And then the question is, how do you get access to a neural system? There are mainly two types of access. You can have direct access to the neural system or indirect access to the neural system. And the mode of access, if you have direct, can be privileged or brute force. So if it's privileged, you are granted access to the neural system that is your target. If it's brute force, you are basically forcing yourself into the neural system. And indirect access can be directed or not directed, which means how tailored it is to a specific target. If it's a group of soccer moms, or a religious group, or if there is no specific groups, just a society at large. And it can be more or less neuroergonomic. So by that, I don't mean that it increases the performance of the people, but that the method itself is based on knowledge about the target neural system. So if you know how the neural system that you're targeting, whether it being non-human or human, processes specific types of information, then it's neuroergonomic if you tailor the attack vector to the knowledge you have about that system. And if you don't have knowledge, if you just have, okay, I want this message to permeate the neural system, but you don't really understand how the information is processed by your targets, then it's not neuroergonomic. And this works at the level of a single nervous system and also a group of individuals. So this is just an overview of a table that is larger and have more examples in the actual paper, but it sort of divides approaches and how to reach goals into direct access and indirect access methods. So an example for a privileged direct access method is, as I said, directly interfacing with the nervous system with consent from the target. So that could be them willingly taking drugs or viruses or receiving brain stimulation to improve their performance if it is an enhanced goal. If it is a diagnose goal, it could be them saying yes to having electrodes implanted in their brains so that you can read how they process information. Or it could be them using metacognition. So if some event occurred and you want to understand how they thought during the event to figure out where they were influenced, then they can use metacognition to sort of directly interface with their own cognition and maybe for their own sake diagnose themselves, or they can verbalize it to another person that is interested in understanding them. Brute force, directly interfacing with nervous system without consent from target. You can use kinetic force to kill the brain, or a disorganized goal could be viruses that alter brain function, such as what I sort of alluded to earlier, where you could possibly design a virus to increase risk-taking behaviors by targeting dopaminergic cells or cells that respond to dopaminergic cells that are involved in those types of behaviors. Indirect access, you have these directed and neuroergonomic methods that are designed for a specific target and based on neural system knowledge. If it's an unplug goal, you could use LLMs to identify targets at risk for suicide and then convince them to commit suicide by providing them with specific information. And yes, I'm not going to go through all of it, but at the bottom where you have not directed and not neuroergonomic examples, you could have a disorganized goal where the method is to reach that disorganized goal is to use propaganda campaigns aiming to proliferate a specific narrative without concern for who buys the narrative or how individual people process the narrative. Maybe you think that if enough people buy it, then they will either act against the people that don't buy it or convince them that the narrative is true. A point here is that I hope is clear, is that adversaries may use different methods to reach the same goal. So you can use a virus to increase risk-taking behaviors, or you can develop TikTok to make people more impulsive and less patient, stuff like that. What varies is the level of sophistication and the time scale that is considered. So if you have a short time window, you may use direct access methods that has a large FX size and short latency, such as, well, the most shortest is to shoot someone in the head, I guess, but then you could hack prosthetics or whatever. You could have this more long-term approach where you design an influence campaign if you want to make people lose trust in a specific individual or a government over time. I think it's also worth noting that sort of what you could derive from this system is that cognitive goals are not end goals in themselves, but they sort of serve some other end goal that is not purely cognitive. If I remember correctly, it's Clausewitz that says that war, or the violence in war, is used as a means to subjugate the enemy to align them with your goals. So in the end, you want some type of subjugation or response from your targets that is meant to sort of maybe secure your resources so that the people in your country survives or whatever. But the end goal is not to have a cognitive effect, is to gain an advantage over the adversary. The methods vary depending on the short-term and long-term, so it could be biological, technological, judicial, organizational, military, socio-cognitive, whatever. It doesn't matter what the specific method is. What varies are the goals that they are targeting and if they serve a long-term or short-term purpose. So the conclusions I have is that the UnCODE system captures underlying neuroscience principles. It is species, time, and domain agnostic. Hopefully simple and actionable, but some of the feedback I've received argues against it being that simple. But I also think that it allows for a common language, because you can talk about unplug goals. You don't really need to talk about inputs and outputs. You can talk about, okay, this social method was used to achieve an unplug goal, which was the removal of someone from a specific environment. So you don't need to talk about inputs and outputs, but just understand how the methods that are used relate to these types of goals, and that they are defined based on how they relate to inputs and outputs of the targets. And these are my references, and I am done. Open for questions if there are any, or any type of criticism or anything.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation to the Cognitive Security Institute. You may learn more about topics in cognitive security by visiting us at cognitivesecurity.institute.